So we have the chance to welcome this morning the Professor Nick Ashford, Professor of Technology and Policy and Director of the Technology and Law Program at the MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you very much, Professor Ashford, for having tried to cross the Atlantic and the Channel in conditions that apparently were very difficult, but we are very, very happy and honored that you managed to come here. Professor Ashford is co-author of two recent textbooks on technology, globalization and sustainable development, transforming the industrial state, and environmental law, policy and economics, reclaiming the environmental agenda. So you notice that Professor Ashford is really linking issues of law, of economics and of environmental protection, and he's really one of the major analysts globally on what the precautionary principle is useful for. And the talk that he will give us is about the many-faceted nature of the precautionary principle, linking science, technology, social and accountability. Professor Ashford, I leave you the floor for 40 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's obvious that I did not take enough precaution to get here. We should have made our airline reservations to be able to before the crowds came. And I'm very happy to be here. This is the second time I'm here with ANSYS, and very happy to share this with you. I'm only regret that I didn't hear the first session, because what my friends have said there in that session would have been very helpful. So with apologies, I may say some of the same things, or I may say things that are incorrect. Anyway, I'll look forward to a comment and your questions as well. I think it's useful, and I hope it hasn't been done before, to contrast two very different expressions of the precautionary principle. One comes out of the Brundtland experience, and you can read it here, where there are possibilities of large or irreversible effects. Scientific uncertainty should not prevent preventative actions from being taken. This is a permissive use of the precautionary principle. That is, you may use it, you don't have to use it. There is another formulation which occurs sometimes in American law specifically, which is that action should, which means must in English, okay, should is a legal term, right, be taken when there are possibilities of large or irreversible serious effects, reflecting a risk averseness, an averseness to having bad environmental health or safety consequences. And the examples are ones that you know: climate disruption, cancer, reproductive system damage. Now, when the precautionary principle was first floated, shall we say, as an idea, both in Germany, where it originates on this side of the Atlantic, and in the United States, it was not greeted with great enthusiasm by even the scientists, because the scientists said, well, what you're doing is you're rejecting the objective evaluation of risk. And so the disagreement was framed as a difference between, as a conflict between risk assessment and the precautionary principle, which is a completely incorrect formulation of the tensions that exist. And one of the reasons that that's the case is that missing in both formulations was the role that technological alternatives can play in providing a rational process for implementation. That is, not only what is the problem, but what are you going to do about the problem? Now, this whole today's effort is dedicated to the words precaution and innovation. And this relationship has two very different characteristics. One is that the industry perspective is that too much precaution will inhibit innovation. And I want to tell you that the evidence is exactly the other way, that precaution that we have implemented has in fact stimulated new technology. But let's leave that aside. The other way to connect precaution and innovation is that you should take into account, in being precautious, that you set into motion the forces that will bring about innovation to solve the problem. So in the first case, we're simply echoing the kind of often heard statements, which is, Okay, regulation takes money. You withdraw that money from what is called productive activity. If you withdraw the money from productive activity that could be used for R&D, less innovation, therefore it's bad. That's the simple-minded approach without taking dynamic technology into account. Much more sophisticated way of saying is, how does new regulatory demands change the whole picture for the development of technology, substitution, R&D, and that's a very different perspective. Now, limiting the reach of the precautionary principle, which is on the minds of some, will limit social protection, environmental restoration, because scientific uncertainties can be trumped, can be overridden by potentially large costs for protection and restoration remediation costs. In the context of the European Union, we have this term proportionality, which is you should pay attention to hazards, but the measures by which you control them should be proportional to the size of the danger. Not too much, don't go overboard, don't overregulate for fear that you will hurt, in the first sense, the stimulus for innovation. And so, and this is not a new argument. Let me say that I've been in this area for over 40 years, and I'm sorry to say, the arguments that are presented were introduced in the 1970s. There is nothing new in the arguments. It's just old wine in new bottles. And so one has to look a little more carefully. And finally, to close this line of argument, the principle that was developed reflected the development in the United States of what's called case law, the Anglo-Saxon tradition of law, and through national and international load codification, which is the German approach, the French approach. And these two different approaches to developing ideas about the precautionary principle have led us to different places. Now, again, a very fast history. The origins of the precautionary principle actually are in the U.S. system. And for those of you that know me, I am not an advocate of America knows best. And by the way, nor am I an advocate that MIT, where I come from, knows best, because I've been very critical of both of these. And perhaps that's why I'm one of the few Americans that are invited to come across the pond to address the issue, because there are not too many of us. But anyway, the origins are in the U.S. regulatory system. I'll talk about two very specific cases in a minute. It was a later formulation in international and European code-driven law. There was a principle written here. And then we, of course, must notice that after the Reagan, and by the way, Thatcher revolution, we lost precaution. We stopped using it in the context of protecting standards, while the Europeans got more and more interested in it. And of course, what the tension seems to be is that the triumph of utilitarian ethics, meaning cost-benefit analysis, is the way you decide what and how much to regulate, as opposed to the American scholar John Rawls, who in his theory of justice said, it isn't a question of a bigger pie, it's a question of making sure that the least advantaged people are made relatively better off. And so distributional effects are essential to an alternative system of justice. And I'll come back to say something about cost-benefit analysis. Because rather than risk and the precautionary principle being in tension, it is actually cost-benefit analysis and the precautionary principle that are in tension. That's the really difference, and I'll explain what I mean about that in a minute. Now, there were subsequent rediscovery of the precautionary principle and attempts in the U.S. to import it from EU law. I mean, if you can't persuade your local officials to do something, you say, well, look what Europe's doing. And Europe does the same thing. Well, I mean, we want to change, so look what the U.S. or where Asia is doing. It's like the child who wants to go to the movies and says to his mother, well, Dad says I can go to the movies if you say I can go to the movies, and then go to father and say the same thing. And the kid goes to the movie. Neither one of them had agreed that you should go to the movies. But anyway, you find that play. Now, this is what it's all about. Regulations and addressing environmental health and safety standards incur costs and deliver benefits. And the benefits may be economic effects, which are characteristically calculated in euros or pounds or dollars. Health and safety effects, the benefit of health and safety, which, by the way, has its origin in risk assessment. So you do as good a job as you possibly can to characterize the risk, because that is the benefit of controlling a hazard. And on the environmental side, preventing ecosystem damage and the loss of species and so forth. Now, what conventional cost-benefit analysis does, what people at the University of Chicago, where I learned my economics but never believed them, was that basically the benefits have to exceed the cost. And now, how are you going to take this array where different groups of people, producers, workers, consumers, others, and the substitutes that might arise, like substitute producers, workers, consumers, and bystanders, how are you going to compare the economic costs with a lost life, with a traffic fatality, and of course the heroic assumptions that are made by traditional economists is you place a monetary value on the human life. You see how much cheaper it is to live in a polluted air environment, and so you calculate the cost of clean air by the number of cans of paint that you put on their house to restore the house to principal condition. So the cost-benefit analysis not only places monetary values on the benefits, but it also, like all good money, you discount the money. Money incurred later on is worth less than money incurred now. And Sir Nicholas Stern, in his famous analysis of the greenhouse gas problem, was eaten alive by his fellow economists because he dared to use a discount rate which was lower than that for money in calculating the benefits of climate change remediation. But not only do you place a monetary value and you suppress the long-term benefits, but you also collapse the columns and collapse the rows, and your only answer is, do the benefits exceed the costs? And that's the predominant neoclassical traditional approach. There's another way to do that, which is don't do any of those things I just said. Leave things in euros, which are appropriately in euros. Leave things in fatalities prevented, cases of cancer prevented, ecosystems destroyed, and look, just look what you're trading off for what. Now let me tell you the disturbing thing to analysts or economists. You don't get a number. That is, there's never a right answer as to how precautionary you should be. There are inherently incorrect answers. That is, you can do things which are really ridiculous, but there's such a range of answers to the question, what should the level of exposure to benzene in the workplace be? Should it be 10 parts per million, 9 parts per million, 8 parts per million? And there is no inherently correct answer because you are not using a uniform metric. But what it does allow you to do when a person who is in a politically responsible position or a corporation is say, look, I am incurring these costs to get these near and far-term benefits, and I will put my head on the chopping block. I will be accountable to the society for having made a decision which is acceptable. So you foster accountability, not accounting. It's not mechanical, and of course, analysts hate it when you can't come up with the right answer, but of course, maybe we should grow up from that problem. Now, I'll give you two examples of U.S. law, and I apologize if you've been through this, but one of the earliest and most significant pieces of legislation in the United States passed in 1970 was the Occupational Safety and Health Act. Those of you that are interested in the environment will remember that the data for chemicals predominantly come from the workplace. That's where you have a large number of people for a long period of time and where the exposure might be measured. And so the Occupational Safety and Health Act, which was passed, basically required the Secretary of Labor to set standards, and I quote, such that no employee, not a single worker, suffer material impairment. Of course, there you've got risk assessment questions or epidemiology, based on the best available evidence, not not a statistical straitjacket, but the best available indication that you've got a problem, to the extent feasible. Now, what's really important is that the limits of protection are defined by feasibility. What kind of feasibility? Yes, economics could be taken into account, but the U.S. legal system said, listen, a large number of dragging industrialists can be put out of work, can be put out of existence, and the standard can still be feasible. As long as the industry basically remains healthy, the laggards, to use the language in the case, should be put out of and can be put out of work. But feasibility is mostly about possibility. That is it technologically possible to control the standard within reason? And that has been the test in the Occupational Safety and Health Act. And more than that, I mean, the point is that on challenge, because in our system, as opposed to many of the European systems, we have what's called judicial review. After the standard has been proposed, it comes under challenge by the industry, by the unions, to see whether or not it's either too lax or too stringent. And the question is always satisfied, to read the bottom 4 lines, by the policy judgment made by Congress about issues that are on the frontiers of scientific knowledge. Frontiers of scientific knowledge does not mean well-established P equals P01 or less strong association. It means that there is an indication that there are problems and we don't know the final answers. And the courts endorse specifically erring, making a mistake on the side of caution. Precautionary. And this comes out of the asbestos decision, and you know there's no more notorious carcinogen than asbestos. Everybody knows what the problems were. Now, more than the occupational situation, in the Clean Air Act, 2 different kinds of standards. One are called the criteria pollutants. You know about those: carbon monoxide, SO2, NOx, particulates, ozone. And the congressional mandate is protect public health with an adequate margin of safety through ambient standards without taking costs into account. So not only is it balancing protection heavily against costs drop out of the picture. It's a health-based standard. Congress sought to protect people from the historically bad air pollution. Costs were irrelevant. Was that because they weren't concerned about costs? No, it's because they understood full well that there was an ability to control these hazards through that mechanism. Second vehicle is the so-called industrial standards. I won't talk about those. But in 1980, with the addition of a new criteria pollutant for lead, whose origin was lead in petrol, right? The Court of Appeals, which reviews this, said that in looking at the standard, first of all, Congress directed EPA administrator to err on the side of caution in making these judgments. I mean, nothing could be clearer than the fact that one must be precautionary. And by the way, that's a mandate. That's not permissive formulation of the precautionary principle. That's required. And that Congress made it abundantly clear that costs could not be taken into account, that it must affect those that are also particularly sensitive, not the average person. And the most significant thing about this opinion, and look at what it says, Congress specifically directed the administrator to allow an adequate margin of safety in setting primary air quality standards in order to provide some protection against effects that research has not yet uncovered. How much more precautionary could you be than that statement in protecting the public from clean air? I mean, you don't have to have suggestive data. I mean, if it looks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, you should assume it's a duck. And by the way, what's very important to understand is almost without exception, in our joint experience of regulating health, safety, and environmental hazards, a whisper has turned into a shout. And the work from the European Environmental Agency, late lessons from early warnings, show emphatically standard and hazard after hazard. We waited far too long to take action. And I want to say a word about spurious correlations, because somebody will raise the question, so I'm going to save you the trouble. If you take pennies and you throw them in the air on the floor, you will find a cluster of pennies. Statistically, things will accidentally cluster. The question is, if you find a cluster of cancer in a community, is that like pennies? I mean, statistically, you could get a cluster, and the existence does not prove any kind of a problem? And the answer is emphatically no. Why is it no? Because what you're not doing, you're not throwing pennies on an empty floor. You're throwing pennies on a floor which is full of other people's having thrown pennies. So you've got clusters right, you've got clusters left. Some are causatively related, some were thrown intentionally into the corner. You throw additional handful of pennies, and that cluster doesn't look any different than what the background is. But one thing you should understand about health safety and environmental epidemiology and toxicology is only the robust effects show through the noise. It is not an accident that you get clusters of association for disease. And we have been fed a lot of malarkey by somebody saying, well, tossing pennies and you get a cluster. It's not penny tossing. Only the strongest relationships show through, because the background, the control groups of people who have a variety of diseases, in fact, much of that disease comes from occupational environmental exposures, which we'll never uncover. We'll never uncover it. You know, we are not an isolated group of rats to whom one exposure has been imposed. So you should dissuade yourself that suggestions of a problem, you know, basically should be disregarded, because they are very significant. A whisper does morph into a shout. And I should remind you that in the standard setting apparatus, we continue to tighten up our standards. The occupational lead exposure was at one time, occupational air exposure was 1.5 micrograms per cubic meter. It's now 0.15, a factor of 10 lower on the emergence of new data. The new data always requires a tightening of the standards. So this is the background against which the precautionary principle has been born. Now, I want to talk about innovation. Part of my life away from environmental health and safety has been on the issue of innovation. And this is a curve that really is the fundamental curve for talking about what kind of innovation and why are we concerned about innovation. And if you see this, this first curve here, it says current existing technology. Think about an internal combustion engine and think about the fact that if you want to improve the performance, right, of an internal combustion engine, whoops, I don't want to do that. Okay. You can have low performance at low cost, higher performance at higher cost, and this solid curve represents the existing technology approaches before any kind of serious innovation occurred. And you can make minor changes to the internal combustion engine, and they will improve the performance at an increased cost. However, you can also change dramatically some of the features of the internal combustion engine. You can have fuel injection. You can have heated manifolds. You can move from a V8 to a V6. That shifts the entire curve. It shifts the entire curve so you get innovation. And that occurs quite naturally. It occurs quite naturally as people seek efficiency and greater profit. And yes, that's important for society. The important lesson, though, is that the curve shifting is likely to come from the incumbent firm. It's likely to be the automobile industry as it is that's likely to develop the improvements, from suppliers, from people who come to them with a new idea. But there's another dramatic shift in technology, and that represents the future technology, which gives you enormous benefits in terms of increased performance or lower cost or both. So I'll say that, you know, it was very clear that when California required zero emission vehicles for 10% of their fleet, The EPA required that. In fact, the director of our technology and policy program said how stupid EPA was because the technology that emerged for the electric car in the early days, you couldn't drive the car, it was too expensive, it was too heavy, and it was considered a technological failure. You would never have had what in fact ultimately emerged, which is the hybrid automobile by Toyota, which marries a small internal combustion engine and a small electric motor, and you get 3 to 4 times the kind of fuel efficiency you ever got before. Now, was this a technological breakthrough? No, it was a mental breakthrough. This is what you call architectural innovation. And it's important that it was Toyota who'd always been at the forefront of technology development. Every other hybrid automobile doesn't compare. And now, of course, there's a new curve. It's called the Tesla, which is an entirely electric automobile. I don't know if you've ever had a chance to look at the guts of the Tesla. It doesn't look like a car. There are hardly any moving parts. And so you find these dramatic changes by people who were not in the automobile industry ultimately, the Tesla and the like. So this is the difference between, thank you, technological innovation by the incumbent and technological innovation by a new entrant that is stimulated by opportunities. Okay, now much has been said about the effects of innovation on regulation on innovation. And Michael Porter is a professor at Harvard. That's that small liberal arts school down the river from MIT. You may have heard of it, right? And Mr. Porter says, well, I noticed that stringent regulation stimulates the incumbent to develop new technology. So here's regulation. And what's the response to regulation? Well, the most simple response is end-of-pipe pollution control. Given to us by the pollution control industry. But if it's a little tougher than that, the regulated firm itself will develop slightly different inputs, right? Process change and product formulation. Mr. Porter noticed that when these improvements were made, which were incremental improvements, companies also saved energy, water, materials, and so there were offsetting costs that made it profitable for the firm to innovate and to be ahead of the curve. And this is the famous Porter hypothesis offered in 1992, 1995. We at MIT argued something very different. From data in the 1970s, and of course I wouldn't expect any Harvard professor to recognize work that was done by that small engineering school on the other side of the river, right? But in fact, when you have stringent regulation, what you really get is you get an entirely set of new products, product services, or processes, which are dramatically different. Let me give you an example. Monsanto made PCBs, which were the guts of transformers and capacitors. No matter how Monsanto tried to meet the requirements that we were phasing out PCBs, all they had in their mind, their mental model, was a biphenyl ring. So polychlorinated biphenyls, you move the chlorines around, you move the bromines around, you don't get the characteristics you want. Dow Silicone, totally different company, came in with a silicone-based material, no biphenyl, and replaced the entire product at Monsanto. So Monsanto loses, Dow Silicone wins, the consumer wins, the worker wins, but this disrupts with disrupting technology the economic picture. The society as a whole doesn't lose. It's just certain stockholders that lose. There are winners and losers. Now, this process of stimulating technology in the United States has been enormously documented. It's documented by the MIT work. It's documented by people, by the way, in Europe at the OECD. And there's no question about the fact that stringent regulation stimulates technology which is economically superior. There are people who lose their markets. Now, how does this work? I want to give you a picture because I think the picture is worth 1,000 words in a sense. Here is a curve which simply represents the risk. This is increasing pollution to the right. Whoops. Okay. and this is the cost of pollution control. So if you want to reduce the risk, it costs you more and more and more and more until finally you reach the limits of technological ability based on existing technology. This is called the efficient frontier. Now, what's on these curves, what populates these curves, is all the different ways in which you control a hazard. Okay. Now, one can argue that if you impose upon the cost curve the demand for clean air, the benefits of clean air, that the economists will simply tell you, look, where these curves cross, right, is what you call the equilibrium point. These are things not too hot, not too cold, not too much regulation, not too little regulation, just right, like the Goldilocks Child's talked about. And you get down to what's considered to be the economically rational R0 level of risk. However, there are new technologies that are to be developed, and they represent a cost curve which is much lower and down to the left. They are more populated by pollution prevention. They are more populated by modern technology. And if you see, one of the advantages is the comparison from the red dot to the green dot, that if you use new technology, you can achieve the same risk level at a much lower cost. Or you can spend the same amount of money, right, and get a much lower risk. And if you believe in equilibrium, you've got a movement from that red dot to this green dot, which is a difference between static efficiency and dynamic efficiency. Dynamic efficiency comes because this curve represents innovation. Not any kind of innovation. Innovation directed towards an environmental, health, or safety goal. And of course, it makes sense because this triangle here, defined by the black dot, the red dot, this green, that's the win-win situation. Now, this is not a figment of my imagination. It is not the figment of OECD's imagination. Now, what does stringency mean? What does stringent regulation mean? Well, it means one of two things fundamentally. Either compliance gets very expensive using existing technology, which spurs the search for alternatives, or compliance requires that you have to have innovation because existing technology will not do the job. It doesn't perform that well. Now, you can also define in popular parlance compliance, which is basically a dramatic reduction from the existing regulatory toleration to a much stricter standard. Example, vinyl chloride used to be regulated at 250 parts per million in the workplace. The new standard was 1. What happened when you move, and by the way, when you talk about dramatic movements in risk reduction, you are really reflecting one of the two bullets above. Either it's very expensive to comply or the present technology can't do it. So when you make dramatic shifts in the allowable exposure level, you're going to bump up against one, the first bullet or the second bullet. By the way, the UK, who always are gentlemen and they bargain with industry about what the appropriate workplace standard should be, what did they choose as a standard? 15 parts per million as opposed to America's 1 part per million. Do you think you got any new technology at 15 parts per million? No. What happened to the requirements in the United States that the exposures be 1 part per million? You had dramatic changes in polymerization technology. And there's example after example after example that you have. So we have to stop talking about job-killing regulation, innovation-killing regulation. It's total nonsense. I mean, this is 2015. Stop talking nonsense. It's not. Yes, a single firm may be put out of business, but there's so much technological capacity and ingenuity that providing you have strong signals and industry knows where to engineer to, you'll always get a response. We've never, ever over-regulated beyond the capacity to meet a technological response. Now, it was useful to take 2 seconds and talk about not just the American work, which I was responsible for, and Mr. Porter, but the OECD work, who's just come out with a report arguing that stringent environmental policies are necessary for addressing well-being objectives. And it does not have to be detrimental to aggregate productivity. And here's a distinction that's very important. A temporary boost in productivity growth materializes for technologically advanced firms and countries, providing you have flexible instruments. And by the way, standards can be flexible because they specify a target, but they leave to industry the mechanism of achieving that target. It's not the same as a design standard. And the advanced firms may be better suited to grasp new opportunities, innovation, improvements, although they may also relocate. We don't really have much evidence for that. Low productivity firms experience a temporary fall in productivity, and they may be more in need of investment to comply, less to adapt. Winners and losers. They're winners and losers. But what's the ultimate outcome? Well, achieving both economic and environmental objectives requires new ideas, technologies, and business models, and environmental policy do more not to prevent these to enter the market. Don't prevent the new technology from coming into the field by being overly sympathetic to the incumbent. That's the lesson. There is no evident trade-off between stringency and competitiveness for the society as a whole. And ensuring swift reallocation of resources can help assure economic outcomes. Now, what does the precautionary principle apply to? We've heard this before, but I'm going to add something new. There are large uncertainties or indeterminacies or ignorance about the serious irreversible harm to health or the environment. There are problems whose outcomes we are not certain about, and by the way, you may not be able to use risk assessment. But persistent bioaccumulative chemicals are examples. The benefits and costs of intervention span different time frameworks. You spend money now, you get technology later. Cost-benefit analysis is a totally inappropriate way to measure where we should be and to what extent we should regulate. The distributional effects are very important. Not only people who are differentially affected, and we know that poor people and poor countries bear the brunt of poor environmental policies, but also firms of a distributional. But here's the addition. Risks continue from production and product technologies that have remained static for some time, and therefore there are opportunities to change technology through innovations. The failure of articulating the technological options in formulating the precautionary principle, I think, was a very bad mistake. Well, that's because, toxicologists and epidemiologists who own the precautionary principle don't know anything about technology. And technologists are unlikely to know very much about the health and safety of their products. So what am I suggesting instead? Okay, so here's the array of effects. You look at the costs, and you begin to realize, and there are data here, that the pre-regulatory assessment of costs of compliance routinely are at least 3 to 5 times more expensive than it turns out to be. Why? Learning curves are ignored. Innovation is ignored. You only get the data from the incumbent, so of course he's going to tell you it's going to cost me an arm and a leg to regulate. That the benefits, which is gotten from risk assessment, have high uncertainties on them. Where if you have something that has a Gaussian distribution, very narrow distribution of effects, you can do a good job of integrating what the benefits are likely to be. If you've got something 3 orders of magnitude wide, how are you going to do that? It's the calculus doesn't lend itself to a comparison of cost benefits in that way. So I'm arguing that we have accountability by taking into account not only the risk question, but the opportunity to stimulate new technology. Fostering accountability rather than accounting, looking clearly at technology options analysis. And lawyers have suggested this, that the burden of proof, the strength of evidence, should vary with the extent of the problem. The less serious the problem, the more demanding you could be of scientific proof. The greater uncertainty and the more serious of a problem, the more you should be forgiving of the fact that you don't have convincing and clear evidence. In other words, link causality to the level of desired protection. The burden of persuasion is not the same as the burden of proof. Burden of persuasion says who's got the burden to show either that the chemical is harmful or that it's safe. And one has to look to see, and REACH, the REACH initiative, moves the burden of persuasion back onto the industry in the process of authorization. But you have to think about going beyond risk reduction to sustainable development. So what can you do to improve the implementation of the precautionary principle? You can minimize uncertainty by refining risk analysis. I want to tell you that if this is all you do, risk analysis will be a bottleneck and you will not deal with most hazards because we don't have enough toxicologists or lawyers if you choose to use them as the subjects in toxicological experiments, right? That's a joke. Then we, recognize that you cannot depend entirely on animal experiments. That's why we use structure-activity relationships in Europe. The U.S. has rejected that. The U.S. chemical industry has rejected it completely. But of course, if you know vinyl chloride is a carcinogen, you know damn well vinyl bromide is going to be a carcinogen. You don't need the animal experiment. You have to minimize uncertainty also through undertaking technology options analysis, safer inputs, production methods, and final products. Make the product a different way. Make a different product. And that may require a shift in who's doing it. Now, what's fundamentally going to be operational in applying the precautionary principle is what kinds of mistakes do you want to tolerate? Now, you've heard that, people talk about type 1 versus, I can't stop, ignore the second line. Risk avoidance. So you're going to make a type 1 error, type 2 error. You're going to have too much regulation. It turns out the hazard isn't what you thought it was going to be. As I've indicated to you, it's pretty damn hard to come up with an example where we read it wrong. Or do you want to regulate with the idea that you might be regulating something that it turns out not to be a hazard? We don't make the second kind of mistake. But there's another thing that enters in here, and that is we're working on the wrong problem. We're working on the wrong problem. You make a back-of-envelope calculation of the risk, but then you look to see what kinds of mistakes you might be making by not stimulating new technology. That is, are you going to let the incumbent decide what level of protection? Are you going to be like the UK and regulate vinyl chloride at 15 parts per million when stimulating technology could get you 1 part per million? Now, if you're beholden to a particular industry, and in America we have the best government money can buy, so, we come from an area where it's certainly possible for a specific industry, coal, for example, to dictate the energy policy. If you're going to be beholden to that kind of economic pressure, you're not going to get new technology. So in concluding, do not be seduced by the argument that regulation kills innovation, regulation kills jobs, that we can't do it technologically, that we must be using cost-benefit analysis to decide where the appropriate balance is, because we have basically, as David G. has shown in his wonderful 2-volume set about late lessons from early warnings, we have been far too timid. And the world is heating up. The world is heating up. This is a historic time, not only from an environmental perspective, but from an economic perspective. Our children will be asking us, what did we do during the economic crisis? Like we ask our parents, what did you do during the Depression? What policies were put into place? What bureaucrats did you demand what from? Or are we just going to let it happen and lie back and let the train roll over us? We are in serious trouble with regard to environment, with regard to finance, and the one issue which will prevent us from spending significant advances is employment. We have never been in a period where labor has taken so long to reclaim its number of jobs at a wage which is a fraction of the wage that people had before they rejoined the workforce. Greece is a very interesting case, because while the press has been enormously against the Greeks in terms of being lazy, corrupt, hardworking, and being obstreperous, if you know the Greek situation, then you know the Cyprus situation, and Portugal, and Spain, and Ireland, and Italy. And the point is, when you are encouraged to buy an enormous amount of products with cheap money that you can never pay back, it's like the American housing crisis. The mortgage companies gave people mortgages they knew they'll never be able to pay back because they privatized the profit That is, if they do pay back, you get the gain as the lender. But we socialize the risk. The taxpayer pays the risk. And what Greece is about is Merkel's job. Because if she gives the Greeks a haircut, she'll lose her point. If she lets the euro collapse, which is the other choice, she will also lose her job. The question is, how do you want to lose your job? Do you want to do the right thing? You do not want to do the right thing. Excuse me, but I come from a Greek origin, and this issue hurts me immensely to see the kind of sacrifice that people are making while people are just simply accusing with epithets the kinds of things that are happening. You should really look into the situation, do you care? Because those lenders are going to come after you for your pound of flesh too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Ashford, for a very clear message and your conclusions on how we should think twice when we think about preserving jobs and what it can mean for our questions. We have got, I'm sorry for that, je suis vraiment désolé, nous avons 5 minutes pour des questions au Professor Ashford.
Do I need French?
J'ai une question ici et une question ici. Si vous voulez bien vous présenter, bien sûr.
Yes, I'm going to ask the question in English, so you don't. I'm here. Hello. Could you comment a little bit about the problem of lock-ins, technological lock-ins, and how they play into your description of innovation?
The problem of lock-in? Yeah, I mean, lock-in is probably one of the most significant problems facing the industrial nations, and that is the existing incumbents basically are fixed in their ideas, and so you will not find sufficient innovation coming from the firms which the economists say are economically bounded or economically rational. That all organic organisms, from people to bacteria, need change, need to be displacing. And Schumpeter, the great Austrian economist, talked about the winds of creative change. Now, the lock-in itself wouldn't be so bad if the lock-in also didn't extend to the political system. Piketty, as your countryman has shown, enormous distribution of wealth disparities, but it's connecting the disparity of wealth, not that you could distribute that wealth and everybody would be really happy, with political power. And two very important political scientists at Princeton University named Gillens, I forget the second name, did an analysis, and he asked a very important question. It's universal. Do the American people, which represent a democracy, get what they want out of the political system? And they analyzed 1,700 pieces of major legislation, like raising the minimum wage, like regulating mercury, like whatever. They found that in 96% of the time, the economically elite got the policies they want. The people only get the policies they want if they coincide with the economic elite. I mean, this is proof positive that we know who runs the government. It's a very, very small number of people who define the agenda. And so democracy as an institution, which I might say was invented by the Greeks, right, has to be made workable. And lock-in is an absolute essential. And you start with reforming the financial system. I'll just say one more word. The U.S. learned from the Depression. We had a Federal Reserve System. You couldn't have a different interest rate in Mississippi and Massachusetts. But the European Central Bank allows Germany to lower its interest rates, loan cheap money to the southern countries, close their own factories that produce refrigerators and cars, and then all of a sudden can't pay their bills. You need to look at this issue really squarely, because the lock-in combined with political influence is enormous. It represents a real challenge to democracies. Probably didn't want the answer I gave you, but anyway.
Une deuxième question ici.
Oui. In English? Yes, okay. Yes, I'm very interested in, I'm from ANSES, and very interested in what you said about the competitivity and competitivity related to compliance. Hearing you, to comply to a new regulation means that the industry must accelerate the new technologies development, because you say that the new regulation standard, a new regulated standard, will push to for new technologies.
If it's stringent enough. If it's stringent enough, yes.
Yes. That means that if we want the new regulation standards not go against the competitivity of a country, we must be sure that the industry has very well long ahead, the information of the change of the regulation, the change of the standards. My question is, according to you, what is the right balance? Because if we want the industry be well ahead informed about the change of the standards, that means that they have to be a little bit a part of the discussion on the regulation. According to you, what should be the right balance of the relationship between the industry and the government in regulation standards elaboration, in this work of fixing the new regulation standards? Does the industry has a role to play here, and in order to be informed well ahead about what's changing?
I'll give you a nuanced answer. First of all, there is innovative industry, inherently innovative industry, and industry which is not innovative. So if the industry is innovative and capable of developing the improvements in technology, then inviting them to the table with government can lead to a very good result. If the technology that's on the shelf is not good enough, then while incumbent industry has to be part of the debate, somebody has to represent the technology of the future. Now, who is going to represent the technology of the future? If the government only represents the economic interests of the incumbent, they're not at the table. If the NGOs are technologically literate, not just environmentally literate, then they can argue that, well, in Germany or in the United States there's a much better technology and we should adopt it, or we should develop an even better technology. The academics, which in the United States, I'm sorry to tell you, are almost summarily co-opted, compromised by industry, by offering grants here and there, so that public interest is no longer served by academic institutions like MIT, right? Then we got a problem. But at one time, the academics were very important at identifying technology, developing technology. We at MIT just came out with a report called the Innovation Initiative. Don't read it. It's a disgrace. It's an absolute disgrace. What is very impressive about a recent publication of MIT is something called The Second Machine Age by Brynjolfsson. If you know Danish, you know how to spell that. And that argued the following. This is the future. The future is ICT, information communication technology, artificial intelligence, robots. And it will end up hiring and supporting at a very high salary a small number of very technical people. And the Dow Jones, which is our stock market, will reach 18,000, 20,000, 25,000. That's what you look at when you look at your portfolio to see how well you're doing. It will also, however, and that's why the report is so important, hollow out the middle class. Push most of the workers towards a very low and insecure employment situation. And so the country will fracture. It will fracture. That is a real problem in all industrial societies, because the real economy, which is not represented in the stock market, is suffering immensely. The reported economy is doing very well, and if that's what you base your economic smiles on, it's going to be all right.
I will have to take two very short questions and a short conclusion by Nicholas Ashford. I'm very sorry, but I want you to give you the possibility to make some questions.
Je vais parler dans ma langue maternelle, le français.
I don't know if like this works or not.
Does it work?
I don't know. How do we?
Channel 2.
Yeah. Okay. Please.
Oui, merci de m'écouter en français. Voilà, il y a un western américain.
So you'll have to translate. It doesn't work.
You can translate. Go ahead with your question.
Oui, il y a un western américain qui se termine, je crois, en indiquant que quand la légende est plus belle que la réalité, il faut écrire la légende. Et j'ai l'impression que je voudrais vous reparler de la réalité aux États-Unis. C'est une question, non pas une opinion. Au nom de, grâce à la production de gaz de schiste aux États-Unis, l'emploi repart à fond, venant créer des nouvelles usines, des nouveaux emplois, ce que vous avez d'ailleurs vous-même dit en disant que c'était un bonheur de créer des emplois, que c'était très important. Et pour autant, quand on regarde la situation du gaz de schiste aux États-Unis, certains disent que c'est quand même une analyse coût-bénéfice ou une décision qui est d'une nature différente que celle qui a été prise sur l'air. Et avec tous les débats d'ailleurs sur les accidents de train au lac Mégantic, au Canada ou ailleurs. Et donc je voudrais que vous me reformuliez votre analyse eu égard à la décision américaine, qui d'ailleurs se prend aussi en dehors dans les pays d'Europe. Et pour ma part, je n'ai pas d'avis en tant que spécialiste sur le développement du gaz de schiste et tout ce que vous avez dit auparavant.
Merci beaucoup. On va prendre une dernière question, mais vraiment rapide, Stéphane, si vous voulez bien.
Yes, thank you very much. I was just wondering, you pointed out a little bit that we have problems with unemployment. So how do we avoid that the disruptive, innovative technology designs the worker out of the workforce? Because I think you've said a number of times that unemployment is actually one of the greatest threats to sustainable development overall. So I'd really like to hear how you resolve that issue. Nick, thank you.
Let me answer the second question first, and that is, and I've written widely on this and I can make it available to you. Look, for 75 years we have been replacing labor with physical capital and energy. We have now reached a point in the United States and are approaching it rapidly in Europe. We do not need people working 40 hours a week in full employment because we have the factors of production which are owned by management, and the truth is we don't need the large number of workers that we have. So if you want to change that process, there's a number of things you can do. One is, and I know the French had a failure with this experiment, but that's because they did it wrong. You can move to a 4-day work week with full pay and spread the work out so that everybody is employed. Number two, you can design work back into the production system. You know, Herman Daly he says, if we want less pollution and we want more work, how come we're not taxing pollution and we're taxing labor? I mean, it seems to me you don't have to have a brilliant bullet. Stop doing the thing which is asinine and backwards. You want work, you don't tax work. You have the compensation packages paid out of sales or a percentage of profit. So we're doing things, and we've known that for a long time. It's not original to me. I think you have to seriously think about what the industrial state is about. And that means that, I mean, we cannot have the production of an economy that's grown at 9% per year and have consistency with the planet. There's this movement that people start to talk about and have made fun of, but I urge you to be more serious about it, and there's the question of selective degrowth. You have to understand what that is about. So I can go on, but I mean, there is a way of restructuring the tax code, the technological institutions. Now let me address the issue of shale gas and employment in the United States. First of all, these are the facts. That the unemployment rate has gone down, which you can say, that's marvelous. But if you factor in the wage time, the number of workers that have been added, you realize that the total money transferred to labor has in fact also gone down. That is, you can have a job at a fraction of the wage you used to have it, and it looks great. The second thing about unemployment rate, which is classical, is people who stop looking for a job are no longer counted in the rate. The rate in the United States is now technically 5.5. It's really more like 12%. It's really more like 12%. People who cannot get jobs have stopped looking for them. Now, shale gas, well, we're an energy exporter. This is a way of continuing energy use. And as long as we've had cheap energy, and there's a man named Robert Ayers who's an patriot American at Fontainebleau, who's, I have to tell you, the smartest person I've ever met, who's an energy economist, and talks about the end of exponential growth. And he says, the period of great innovation, what we had in the Industrial Revolution 160 years, is all explained by access to cheap energy. We are over cheap energy. I mean, nobody who is fracking has ever made any money, because you cannot do that in an economically sensible way. And you add to pollution problems. If energy carried the full freight, the full environmental freight, health and safety freight, it would be much more expensive than it is. And that's why a carbon tax is really an absolute necessity. I want to tell you one more thing, which is in British Columbia, which is a province in Canada, they adopted a carbon tax. And the first thing that the energy industry did is say, oh, this is going to, you know, you're going to have to pay more at the petrol pump. You should vote against the carbon tax. But the British Columbia politicians did something very smart. Rather than recycling the tax into environmental improvement, which environmentalists want, they basically reduced the income tax. And so when the public was faced with the possibility of eliminating the carbon tax, the government said, sure, we're just going to raise your income tax because this is revenue neutral. And so they did not eliminate the British Columbia carbon tax. We need to have the price of energy carry the full freight. It is not a job creator at a wage which is consistent with economic recovery. It's part of the hollowing out of the middle class and the joblessness that occurs at the bottom. This is a problem that Europe is facing. Europe 2020 recently had a conference, and they had a review of Europe 2020. You know, what does Europe 2020 promise? The most economically competitive, environmentally sound, job-creating economic unit in the world. And what's the report card? Horrible on poverty, horrible on employment, and there's no new ideas. Because being competitive is not the same thing as providing an economy that provides the essential goods to people. Competitiveness has to do with profit. Providing essential goods has to do with economic welfare.
Thank you very much, Professor Ashford. I regret to have to cut that debate, although I have to stress also that the shale gas was also presented by our law specialist as not exactly an application of the precautionary principle. So I think the discussion that you had is very important. Nevertheless, we have also to come back in the next session to really what is the essence of the precautionary principle. Thank you again for your very interesting presentation.